We'll be in the book of James again today, chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 7 through 12 this morning. It's an interesting little passage we have here. Then next week, we'll be finishing up James before Advent season starts. But now, I'm sure, and I would assume, I'm not the only one who's probably worked under someone who was difficult, right? Now, maybe you're in that right now. Maybe you're related to that person that you work under. Don't say if this applies to you or not. But teens and kids, maybe you have a teacher. We have some teachers, so don't say if that's the person. But yeah, thanks, John. That maybe is harder to have than others. You know, I had a teacher when I was in grade school, or I guess it was junior high, who just for some reason didn't like me. And so she was harder on me in different things. And as the semester went on, I began to learn if I wanted a good grade, then I had to just work extra hard in that class. Because it didn't matter what I did, the teacher for some reason didn't or was harder on me. But at the end of the semester, I earned a good grade and went towards the diploma degree the honors diploma thing that I wanted. So I had to patiently endure that particular class and that particular teacher to get where I wanted to go. And for some of you, I know it can be hard to endure hard times. It can be hard to keep going when things get difficult. But this morning, as we look at our passage, we're going to see that James is calling Christians to persevere, to patiently endure, because we have an award awaiting us, a reward awaiting us. So first, let's look at verses 7 through 9. Patiently endure by looking to the future. Let's start in verse 7. It says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." So we have a lot going on here, but the call is all believers in Jesus will at some point need to patiently endure. Now last week, we talked about those rich or wealthy landowners, right, that were in the church and were committing fraud against the workers. We're actually having them sent to court or paying off the courts so that those people would end up, we saw, even being murdered at times through the court system. Now we switch. James is talking about those who are oppressed, those who are on the other side, those who have gone through this mistreatment. And we find that some of this was even happening in the church. James is talking to the church here. So this was happening. And he wants them to know several things. How do we endure these hard times? How do we go through these things? And the first thing he says is, be patient. Now, for me, when someone says be patient, it's normally not in the middle of when I best need to hear it, right? You're normally not being patient at that time, and it's normally not received well. But James says, be patient. Be patient with, and specifically, people. The word here for patient is directly talking about being patient with others, other people. Paul says something similar in 1 Thessalonians 5:14. He says, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." Patience is needed until God ultimately rights the injustices around us. We must be patient because the coming of the Lord is meant to give us hope. The coming of the Lord is at hand, but it's meant to give us hope. It's meant to make us want to endure further, where it serves as a motivation the coming of the Lord is at hand, is what James says. And Paul again. It's interesting, you find through the New Testament these themes. You can see that a lot of these people in a lot of these churches were going through the same things. And it's really not that different than what we go through now either. Now, maybe we don't experience the same type of persecution that they experienced, but it seems that those people were going through some of the same things we go through in life as well. And this is one of them. Paul, in particular, he had a very hard life after his conversion. And for those, I don't want to assume everyone knows his story, but Paul suffered like probably none of us have ever suffered. I mean, if you imagine, you read time and time again, Paul was almost stoned to death. Sometimes they left him because they thought he was dead. He also was in prison much of his life after his conversion. And it's not a fancy prison that we know of today. These were Roman prisons who were often underground in caves with very little light, and often the sewage system ran through these caves. So it wasn't a pretty picture. Paul suffered a lot. And something that hit me the other day is Paul had to remember his life prior to his conversion. And for those who don't know, he persecuted Christians. He actually had several killed before he came to Christ. And he had to live with that knowledge. And I think that's why he says that he counted himself as the least among the apostles. Because he had to daily live with that reminder. So you think about Paul as a man who suffered much. He suffered. And then we come to Romans 8:18. And listen to this. He said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Believers endure knowing that this is not the end." This is not it. There may be hard times, but this is not it. We have a future hope that awaits us in Jesus. One day we will be with Him. And James compares this to a farmer, right? Some of you, a lot of you just finished that season, and it's the spring you plant, and it's different in the Middle East. They're a little more dependent on rain, as you can imagine, but there's a rainy season, and James kind of points to this. The people there would have known what he was talking about, but he compares it to you plant in the spring, and you just hope in the fall you harvest, and it's well, and especially you hope that you get the rains that James points to here that will bring about a good harvest. And he compares that to our waiting for Christ to return. One day, it's not right now because we're still here, but Christ will return. And we wait for that patiently, just as a farmer waits for his harvest in the fall. And then he says in verse 8, he reminds us to establish our hearts. And it's basically just a call to have courage, to commit to the cause, to persevere. Sometimes in life, we just have to commit. It's going to be hard. We know it may be hard, but we just have to commit to the process. We have to be all in and persevere. Galatians 6:9, it says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." Why? Because temptations will come in the midst of our enduring. Temptations will come when it's hard. I find in my own life, temptations are greatest when we're going through something hard, when we are suffering. It is easy to succumb to those different sins that we may be prone to succumb to. And one in particular, when we're going through a hard time, or we work under somebody, or we have a teacher that may be difficult, or whatever it may be, one of those things, James says, do not grumble. Do not grumble. How many times when things aren't going well do we complain or grumble or have a problem or voice those concerns over what is happening? It's easy to succumb to this, right? It's easy to complain. Even this past week, I found myself complaining about the cold, right? I'm not quite ready for that yet, right? But it's easy when things aren't normal, when things seem hard, to succumb to those temptations. And that's why we need this clear teaching. And I think James is so clear. Don't do it. Don't succumb to these temptations. Why? Because the judge is standing at the door. Christ's return is imminent. Now, we don't have time to go totally into that concept of Christ's return, but it says time and time again in the New Testament, Christ will return, and it is soon. Now, what does that mean? We don't know exactly. We don't know when it's going to be or when it's going to happen, but Christ will return. This is not all there is. He will return one day. You know, as I began to think of this, I kept going back to the Christmas Story and the Red Ryder BB gun, right? The little kid, and I didn't like that show as a kid, but as I've gotten older, I find it very humorous for many reasons. But you know, he wants this Red Ryder BB gun. He has to like wait for it. He walks by the window and sees it and starts imagining. He gives out these little hints to his mom. His mom's totally against it, right? But his dad's like, we'll see, whatever, you know. Wait to get the call. But as we continue, enduring's hard. For them, they have to leave at a moment's notice. Enduring is hard. Waiting can be hard in this life. The kid wanted the Red Ryder BB gun, right? And he had to wait. And he didn't think he got it, and then his dad pulls it around the corner, and he gets it. Sometimes in our lives, life's like that, right? We don't know when the hard times will be over. We don't know when the suffering will be over. We don't know when the grieving will be over, but we can hold on to several truths. And here are 4 of them this morning. First, if you're a Christian, God will use your current situation for your good. Whether it's a good situation or a bad situation, He will use it for your good. Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. God will work out whatever situation this is for your good. Second, if you're a Christian, you're never alone. Jesus says He sent the Holy Spirit to reside in you to be the great comforter. You are never alone as a believer. And then third, if you're a Christian, please reach out to your church family. It's interesting, as you read the New Testament, there really are no solo Christians, okay? There's time and time, even Paul's life, he's calling on Luke, he's calling on Titus, he's calling on Timothy, he's calling on all these guys and saying, you can see that he needed them in his life. He needed a community of believers, and I'll make a little pitch here for our adult Bible study. Because last week, I don't know about you, but this time of year, as we prepare for the holidays, it can be hard. You know, I shared last week that I have always had this image in my head of what it will look like on Christmas Day. You know, all these kids magically coming down the door and or down the stairs and seeing the tree and opening all these presents. It's never like that, right? It's never. One kid's screaming about this, other kid's still asleep. This kid's, you know, has her hair all who knows, and then one kid just wants her bottle, and so it's never like that. And I have to get that dream out of my head. And as we're sharing last week, we're sharing about being intentional about this time of year. Intentionally planning for how to keep Christ the center of this holiday season. And even this week, Christina, one night, made some cookies, and we tried our hand at royal icing, and it was a lot of fun. And it's that intentionality. But we wouldn't have done that if we didn't talk about that last week. We need each other in our lives. We need each other to call us out when we're failing. We need each other to encourage us when it's been rough, when it's been hard. We need one another. And then last, if you're a Christian, know that your current circumstances will definitely change in the future. It may be in this life, it may be in the next. But we know for certain this is not it. Revelation 21, 1 through 4, near the end of the Bible, it says, Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And we look forward to that day, right? As Christians, no matter what you're going through today, we look forward to that truth. We must hold on to that truth as hope in the future. So we don't only patiently endure by looking to the future. Now, James switches this up. We patiently endure by looking to the past. Look at verses 10 through 11. James says, As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Now James, remember, he's talking to Jewish Christians. Many would have had much of the Old Testament memorized, but if they didn't, they would have known who these key figures were throughout the Old Testament that we read about. And he is calling on these to serve as a model for what patiently enduring looks like. He doesn't name anybody specific at first, but the people in this church would have known who he was talking about. Look at Hebrews 11 through 13. That's specifically what I believe he's referring to in this passage as he's saying these things. And then he does specifically point out one person, and that is Job in verse 11. Now, again, I don't want to take it for granted. We know the story of Job. Job may have suffered more than anyone else besides Christ. I think this is an interesting book we read in the Old Testament. Job probably took place, much of the Bible is not written chronologically. It's not in order. Job would have taken place in the middle part of Genesis. Okay? So Job was a wealthy man. We read that he had several possessions. He had several children. He had several things. And one day, or over a period of time, God took it away. Job suffered much. He lost his health. He lost his family. He lost his friends. He lost everything he had. And yet, he never knew why. God never told him why. But the amazing part about Job's story is that he remained faithful. Job never gave in. Now, that doesn't mean Job didn't have his moments, right? His friends are telling him, reject God. There must be some kind of sin in your life. And Job's like, no, there's nothing here. I'm in misery. There's nothing in my life. His wife's telling him, just curse God and die. But Job remains steadfast. He remains faithful. And he almost gives up. And God comes and says, no, Job, this is who I am. Remember who I am. And Job faithfully and patiently endured. He didn't know if he'd make it through the life. He thought he would die in misery. But Job faithfully, time and time again, stood the course. He persevered. He kept going. And in the end, he received several blessings from the Lord. A larger family. More wealth than what he had before. More possessions than what he had before. Better friends than what he had before. Why? Because he realized God is compassionate and merciful. God is the God of compassion and mercy. That's who he is. He cannot be that. God is compassionate and full of mercy. And he takes care of his own. He takes care of his own children. You know, as I began to think about this week, we went to a couple of basketball games. And, you know, you watch the teams, and you know pretty quick whether one team's pretty good or not. And I see that, and I'm sharing with Olivia, we're having conversations about it, and I said, watch how this team runs, and let's see how quickly they give up, right? So you're watching this team, and you can know by the second period whether this team's good or not because it looks like they haven't played at all, because they look fresh. Their faces aren't red. They just keep going and going. They can play the whole game. And sometimes they go to the end and every starter plays the whole game because they can. They've conditioned well. And I find in our lives, much of our perseverance, much of our endurance comes back to relying on the compassion and mercy of God. We must rely on what we know is true. We must rely on the truths of Scriptures that we find, like in the book of James. They serve as hope. They serve as motivation to keep going when things get hard. Lamentations 3:22. The steadfastness of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. God will be with you if you are one of Him. And then our last point, verse 12. We've looked at the future, we endure by looking at the past, and now we patiently endure by looking to the present. And James is getting ready to get really practical here. It says in verse 12, "But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth, or by any other oath. But let your yes be yes, and your no be no, so that you may fall under condemnation." So that you may not fall under condemnation. Believers in Jesus must endure in the present. James is getting very practical. Let's start at the beginning here. He says, "But above all," you could use the word especially here, even more than what he said before. Above all that, he says this. He wants them to know that this is the most important point of all this. He wants them to know that this is where the practicality comes about. Our speech is an indicator of where we are spiritually, of where we are in our maturity in Christ. Our speech is an indicator of that. Now, James gets more specific. He says, "Do not swear." This isn't referring to cursing or something like that. It refers to, and this is where culture comes in, a Jewish practice in the Old Testament. In those days, the Jews were making oaths between each other, but to false idols, to false gods. So these idols, they were worthless. These oaths were worthless, and therefore, they often didn't keep their word. They wouldn't keep their oath between one another. The problem is, the Old Testament makes it clear that oaths can be made, but they're only to be made between them and God. And we see God making oaths. He makes covenants between Himself and His people. So oaths aren't the issue per se. It's who they're making the oaths to. And James says, "Let your yes be yes, and your no be no." James is calling for straightforward, honest, and plain speech. Essentially, he's saying to them, keep your word and do what you say you will do. He's calling for them to be truth speakers, right? He wants them to be truth tellers. He doesn't want them to be liars. Why? Because God hates lying. He hates it. I don't use that word flippantly often, but Proverbs 6:16 through 19, there are 6 things that the Lord hates. 7 that are an abomination to Him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. That should tell you what God thinks about lying. He does not like it. So we are commanded to speak the truth. Ephesians 4:25, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." We are called to be truth tellers. It's a clear indicator where we are spiritually in Christ. We are to speak the truth. We should be known as people who speak truth to one another. So how do we do this? How do we make sure that we are truth speakers? Well, I think one way is to identify areas of lying that we're prone to. I think there are 4 that we are often prone to, right? The first one is We should avoid outright lying. Now, this is just blunt lies, even white lies. We could add that there too. We should avoid those things. Second, we should avoid exaggerating the truth. It can be something, and the image that comes to my mind, right? Christina's dad is a big fisherman, so when we go fishing, we send pictures. And I had Titus take the fish, and it's just this little thing. I had him hold it out real big, so it looks like a monster, right? That's what comes to mind when I think about this. Exaggerating the truth. Yes, he caught a fish. It wasn't quite the monster. It kind of looked like as big as his face, right? And then the third one is avoid half-truths. You can tell the truth, but if it's only half of it, it's not really the truth, right? We've been going through this with one of our kids lately who, yes, I picked up my floor, but I didn't tell you I just threw it all on the floor in my closet, right? It's that half-truth. It's not totally lying, but it's not totally telling me the truth either. And then the fourth thing is we should avoid evading the truth. We should avoid not trying to be truth speakers. We should tell what is true. And these are the types of lying that we need to be aware of. And we need to try to avoid because ultimately it pleases the Lord. Much of this, as I think about Thanksgiving, there's one thing I look forward to on Thanksgiving every year, and that is my wife's turkey. Now, it's taken like 11 years that we've kind of perfected this recipe, right? She's working on this brine, and Olivia came over yesterday to help me out with something here, and I could smell the brine on her coat. So I knew she was preparing this turkey, and I'm not a big turkey fan, but I am of hers. She does this brine, it has this citrusy, goodness. My mouth's watering thinking about it, and it's glorious, right? I love this turkey she makes. It's brown, so it has that little crunch I like. It's perfect. Now the issue is, and I think about the Christmas story again, is that I constantly get ran out of the kitchen after it's cooked because I go and take little bites of it, right? I'm going over there getting a little sample. I just have to make sure it's good. And now I've got a little partner who's not in here, Titus, who follows me. And we start getting that turkey together, and we get ran out of the kitchen again. And it's that, I won't say torture, but it's that enduring process to get that reward, that awesome turkey that you've been looking forward to all year. In life, sometimes things are hard. Sometimes we must learn to endure because the reward is waiting for us. And that reward is Jesus. One day, this will not be it. This is only temporary. But if we patiently endure, he says, it will be worth it. It will be worth it. Let us pray. Father, thank you for today. I thank you for this book of James that we've been reading. And I know we'll be closing out next week, but there's been so many good and sometimes hard truths here. And this is one of those that we all can experience and we can all relate to something that's been hard, or someone that we've worked under that we didn't care for, or some situation that didn't go the way that we thought it would, and we experienced some sort of suffering. And we wonder, why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep going? What's our motivation for doing it? And we can look to earthly things, but ultimately we see that we are waiting for your return one day. That nothing surpasses that hope that you have given us, that we will be united with Jesus one day again. That we will see him, and that we will see that the pain, the misery, the mourning, the tears that we shed, the anxieties we experience, the depressed thoughts that we go through, these earthly things will be no more. We will be with Jesus. And I pray that we will hold on to those hopes and that we won't keep them to ourselves. I know as families get together these next few days, God, I pray for opportunities and boldness that we will share these truths. That as some complain, as some grumble, as some wonder what to say, that we will be leaders in sharing the hope that we have. And that hope is in